Good afternoon, and thanks for joining this panel. I am Diane Anderson, the Executive Director at Case Western Reserve University's Great Lakes Energy Institute. Today, the panel has an opportunity to address many aspects of bringing renewable energy, including the infrastructure and the assets, into a electricity and utility marketplace. We have the opportunity to have views that align and some views that may well not align, and I always think that's good for a panel to represent both. As the way we've set it up is I almost utilize a walk, in essence, through the supply chain, where, like an analog to a Hollywood film, you have a writer and a producer and a director and actors and actresses and critics. And here today, we have the opportunity, if I could, to introduce, on the writer side, Roger Celant. Roger is the Executive Director of Case Western Reserve University's Fowler Center for Sustainable Value. Roger will be able to set a bit of the stage for a course that may have some unacceptable outcomes for us. I then introduce Dave Raskin, and Dave is partner at Steptoe & Johnson, who will look at how energy right now is progressing in the United States, energy policy, and some of the regulatory regimes and where it's going. I will then actually represent a schematic from Dr. Ken Laparo at Case Western Reserve University, who is currently working on energy research in the electricity grid and the connection to renewables. I'll talk a bit about how Case Western and these professors' work is working to bring the cost of energy, renewable energy, down. We then will continue with Carol Battershell, who is a leader in the Department of Energy Efficiency and Renewables Energy Department. Carol, in general, will be able to talk about the role of government and what role it plays in bringing new aspects, and in this case, renewable energy to market, and in specific about the Recovery Act in the United States. And then Jean Amadori, who is managing partner of Great Lakes Wind Energy and an investor in bringing wind to Lake Erie, will talk about the project and, importantly, about what it is to be an investor in bringing renewables to marketplace. It's just today, actually, that the Department of Energy is asking everyone around the country to comment on their strategy mission. And in that strategy mission, they speak of 3 reasons to have policy in energy. One is to enhance energy and national security around it. The second, to reduce the environmental impacts. And thirdly, to increase U.S. competitiveness. And all of those play themes in the discussions that we'll talk about today. As well, when I think of being here and representing this region, both for Canada and for the United States of the U.S. and Canadian, this Great Lakes region, it is interesting that in the last 12 months, Brookings has put out a report about the incredible asset that this region holds. Assets that start with the science that's going on between universities and national laboratories that are in the region between both countries, assets that include the manufacturing assets that are inside of the region, and lastly, significant actual assets in for wind, a large lake, for solar, manufacturing from the largest solar company in the United States for solar out in the western portion of the state of Ohio, for storage, an 80-90-year history between this region and NASA in this region in bringing storage to market. So we have significant assets to play off of. So with that, I look for a good afternoon, and again, thank you for joining. Roger? Oh.
Okay, thank you, Diane. This is about Canadian and U.S. relationships, right? One of my sons-in-law is a Canadian, and I can tell you that there's a lot of negotiating that goes on, especially during hockey season. So I have some experience in that. And I assume some of you are lawyers, and one of my daughters is a lawyer. So I got to be careful what I say because I've been trained to be exact, precise, short, brief and so forth. Okay, so with that as the context, I'd like to speak to you as a business person and to try to remind or to suggest to you that as I practiced business in the past, people would spend a lot of time arguing. In fact, they found many hills to die on just looking at X and Y. And I used to feel like all you need to do is get the quadrant right, and eventually we'll converge on the X and the Y. And I think when we talk about renewables and we talk about fossil fuels, we talk about policies, I would really like to see us converging on the right quadrant. So this talk today is about that. And in order to converge on that quadrant, I'm going to give you a relatively straightforward, simplistic view of some activities that we need to consider when we look at making choices, particularly with regard to technologies and specifically about energy. And I'm going to look just briefly at comparing coal, natural gas, and wind in kind of a Pew diagram sense. There's a lot happening today that looks like it's a tension-filled time. That's not new to us. We've had tension-filled times in the past. Business people should be asking themselves, how do I make money during this tension-filled time, and how can I drive my business to be successful? A back question to that is, how do I do well by doing good? And then a back question to that is, what does good mean? So I'm going to try to frame some questions today and present a quadrant definition of what moving to good or better is like, and how to make some choices. But first I should tell you that as part of the Fowler Center for Sustainable Value, what does sustainable value really mean? And I'm going to be careful because I want to be a little legalistic about this. Sustainable value is a dynamic state that occurs when a company creates ongoing value for its shareholders and stakeholders. The addition of stakeholders is very important. By doing good for society and the environment, part of the stakeholder array, the company does even better for its customers and shareholders than it otherwise would. And I can go on and talk about the shift to shareholder value as opposed to sustainable value, but I don't think I need to do that here. What I would like to do is to offer that humanity for a long time has embarked on taking actions, creating human systems that eventually come back and have some consequences. So we've created systems, whether they're energy systems, water systems, social systems, economic systems. We've done it with the idea of moving forward, but there are consequences when you do that. And the consequences take the form of how does that interfere with the natural systems that are often taken for granted, they're often transparent, but actually support all the living life support systems on the planet. So if you look at the 9 boundaries of nature, which have been really defined pretty well by the Resiliency Institute at Stockholm, published about 2009 in Nature, they basically found that if you take a look at the last 25,000 years, that humanity has thrived because the planet has operated between norms that can basically be described as the 9 boundaries of nature. There's not 100, there's just 9. And if you're interested, but just by Googling video 9 boundaries of nature, you can get people with foreign accents that are very impressive explaining to you why this is true. The 9 boundaries include climate change, which we're all familiar with or have some feeling for, and it's governed, of course, by carbon dioxide, primarily methane and other greenhouse gases. Ozone depletion, which has been depletion has been going up and going down. At the moment, it's relatively steady, but it's affected by carbon dioxide and methane. Ocean acidification, which is affected by carbon dioxide primarily, by the formation of carbonic acid. Biodiversity loss, the rate of species loss. Fresh water usage, which it's getting a lot more conversation today. The nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. Chemical contamination, which has not been measured yet specifically or quantitatively. Land system change, in other words, how much land are we using, what's the size of the footprint, what's changing in terms of desertification, and aerosol loading, which is also not dimensioned yet. But from a business person's perspective, you need to be thinking about these boundaries, or from a policymaker's perspective, so that you don't end up having a consequence that you didn't anticipate. So these are useful criteria. If you take a look at the state of the world today, you can see that in climate change, biodiversity loss, and the nitrogen cycle, we've begun to exceed, and that's why they're colored in red, the boundaries that have been set up for the last 25,000 years. So it would say to me that if you're going to analyze a process or a product design, that you should be very wary about aggravating those particular areas, and you can see in other areas where we're approaching the problem. So how would I apply this in a simplistic way, knowing that what I want to do is to get the quadrant right? So from a sustainability perspective, if you have a product, say this pen, you should be concerned about where it came from. In other words, its extractive source, how it's used, how am I using it in the daily practice of the design of this particular pen, and how is it going to be disposed of? Where is it going to go? And if you take a look then and take a look at your 9 boundaries, and you, for example, you were to begin to compare in just sort of a plus, plus, plus. I didn't use pluses, minuses in a standard Pew kind of diagram. I just simply decided it was tougher to read minuses than it was to read pluses. So I just used pluses in the absence of pluses to sort of show the difference in the comparison. And I threw in social justice, which I think has a lot to do with what it means to do well by doing good, and the implications, particularly at the bottom of the pyramid. So if you take a look at, and this is done, as tough as it might believe from a sustainability guy, this is done just sitting down and taking a look and thinking about life cycle analyses for coal, natural gas, and wind. Surprise. It turns out that if you just simply lay them together, you can begin to see that there's a lot of ways that, for example, coal and natural gas affect climate change. And I have to tell you, just as an internal principle, I gave natural gas an extra plus because of a report that just recently came out of Cornell that talks about fracking and the implication in terms of greenhouse gas effect. Now, whether that's true or not, that's the only piece of data in there that's absolutely up to question. I don't know yet where it's going to go. But just to give you an example, if you look at coal from extraction perspective, natural gas, and wind, you even see that wind gets a plus. And the reason that wind would get a plus is, where do we get the carbon fibers? How are they produced? Where do we get the metallic parts? Where do we get the lubricants and so forth? Or where do we get the precious metals that might be in the magnetics if you're using magnetic coupling? In the use, coal is still generating a lot of carbon dioxide and ash and so forth. Natural gas, of course, has its own carbon dioxide, but it's about 40% less than coal. And if you take a look at wind, of course, when it's blowing and when you're generating, it's actually not creating a carbon footprint. On disposal, things sort of change. You end up with fly ash with coal. Natural gas has, in a sense, a disposal issue because it's also being used in a utility. And what happens with that concrete asset, I shouldn't have said concrete asset, I should have said the asset that you use to convert your natural gas into energy at the end of life. And then also wind. There's an end of life issue that's associated with wind, particularly, well, all the components of that. Until that's worked out, you can't really give it a 0. So I'm just, if you go through and take a look at what's happening here, if you look at the totals, it basically says, getting the quadrant right, that you've got a total of a 48 for coal, a 26 for natural gas, and a 12 for wind, which basically says, even if we're talking wind from the idealistic, purest way, we still have plenty of work to do. Now, none of this is not being said to you to be in any kind of way frightening. It's actually very opportunistic, because knowing kind of where we're headed, knowing the way to measure the criteria, creates incredible opportunities and gives a business an opportunity to see where you can do well by doing good. It gives you an opportunity to see how to combine shareholder value and stakeholder value, and lets you know the potential. This is a many-decade problem. It's not sustainable for a business or an organization to operate in a way that they can't satisfy their customers and make a profit. In my belief, when you really think about sustainable value, it means that you know where you're going, you have an idea how you're going to get there, and you know that you can never go so fast as to bankrupt yourself. Okay? That's it. All right.
Okay, don't start my time until I get this turned on, which I don't know.
On the bottom.
I'm asking.
Didn't make any sense. Okay.
And the right arrow to change places? Okay, thanks. Hi. One difference between Roger's presentation and mine, I'm a lawyer, so words, only words, that's all you get, and I hope most of you feel at home with that. I want to talk about the electricity industry. I've spent 30 years representing it. I've been involved in some of the major cases in which public policy towards the industry have changed during that period, and I think we're in a very interesting and uncertain time, and I want to tell you about it. But the first thing I want to say is I want to make sure everybody in this room understands something that's rarely talked about, but it's very important. We don't have a single energy issue in this country. We have an issue involving the use of foreign oil, and we have another issue involving electricity. We only get the issue involving the use of oil raises very serious national security concerns. It raises very serious economic concerns. We all know what they are. We've heard about them. They're very serious, but people need to understand that that has very little to do with the electric industry, because we only get approximately 1% of our electricity from oil, and we could take that number down to zero fairly easily in a short period of time. So the issues on the electric side of the energy equation don't involve foreign oil. I'm sure all of you have watched commercials. If you're watching TV, and some will come on and there will be something being blown up by a terrorist in the Middle East and a great supply disruption and something really horrible happening with respect to oil. And if you're watching MSNBC, it will then segue to, therefore, we need more renewable energy. And if you're watching Fox, it will segue to, therefore, we need more nuclear power. And whichever station you're watching, that's just all wrong, okay? There's just, the two have very little to do with each other, and you need to keep that in mind when people talk about what our energy policy should be. The fact of the matter is that on the electricity side, we have plentiful options. We have, some would say, an embarrassment of riches. We have plentiful domestic coal. We have recently found that we have a whole lot of natural gas through fracking. We have substantial nuclear. 20% of our electricity comes from nuclear power. And there are several companies who, with government support, would like to build some more nuclear plants. We have substantial hydroelectric capability. We have tremendous wind potential, which is being developed. We have an emerging solar industry whose prices are coming down very quickly, and we have imports from Canada. I had to throw the last one in. The fact of the matter is that there is a lot of surplus energy, particularly in Quebec, and I think a lot of that, which is hydro, surplus hydro, is going to find its way down to the States fairly shortly if we can get the transmission built for it. The problem on the electricity side is that we can't agree on a policy. And probably the primary reason that we can't agree on a policy is that we can't agree on how dangerous global warming, or should I say global climate change, is. I have admitted to Roger a little while ago that I am a skeptic, not about whether this is happening, but whether it's significant. He's already working on me trying to rock my world, and perhaps he'll be successful. But the fact of the matter is that without some further agreement on that issue, it's very hard for us to move forward. And that creates a really big problem because our electric system is getting very old. Most of what you'll read about our existing nuclear fleet, for example, is about extending the life of very old plants. Our coal fleet is very old. And an area that I'm particularly interested in, our transmission grid, is undersized and very old technology. And it was not built for an interstate electric system where we're trading power and moving power long distances, and that's a serious problem. The default choice will be natural gas if we go forward with fracking. There are a number of environmental organizations who are gearing up to fight fracturing shale for natural gas. Roger mentioned a Cornell study that came out just a few days ago, which suggested that the carbon emissions associated with natural gas from fracking exceed that from burning coal to produce electricity. So we've got a battle underway in that area as well. I don't think we will fail to exploit that resource. It's too valuable to us. So I think the debate will end up with some more regulation, but not an end to fracking. That being said, we can create a crisis, and the one way we can create a crisis is that if we say no more coal because of carbon dioxide emissions and global warming, no more nuclear because it's too expensive and too dangerous, and we just had obviously an event which has got people rethinking that, and no more natural gas because the environmental consequences of fracking are too great. If we say no to those three things and say, well, we'll just rely on renewables, we will end up with an electricity crisis because renewables alone can't get the job done, and we'll get into that a little bit more. What's standing in the way in renewable power? We now get about 2% of our electricity from wind and less than 1% of our electricity from solar. So what's standing in the way? Well, the first thing is price. The demand for wind and solar is created by what are known as portfolio requirement laws, where they require utilities to get a certain percentage of their electricity output from renewable sources, and that creates demand regardless of price. The fact is that the delivered price of renewables is still higher, and in many cases significantly higher than the alternatives. And therefore, just allowing the market to work won't work. What I don't say here, and it's also very important, and that is that the renewable industry relies on production and investment tax credits and loan guarantees to drive down cost, and those are going away. For wind power, unless there's new law, that'll be gone at the end of the year, I believe, most of them. And for solar, I think there's another 5 or 6 years. But with what's going on in Washington with the budget now, there's no certainty that those subsidies will exist. Perhaps the biggest physical problem is that the transmission grid is inadequate to support much more interconnection of wind, particularly inland wind, which is much cheaper than offshore wind. And unless we reach agreement on a policy to build out our transmission grid, which I believe fervently we need to do, it's going to be very hard to get much more renewable power onto the grid. The next problem with renewables is that they're not a source of baseload power. You need energy, you can turn it on, it's there all the time. We have a base amount of energy that we need almost every day, almost 24 hours a day, and we need power plants that can provide that energy. We can't rely on solar and wind to be there. They are what's known as intermittent or variable resources, and for that reason, they are less valuable from the standpoint of a system operator who's trying to run an electric system that's designed to make sure that the demand is satisfied. And finally, one of the issues that's really bothering me is state parochialism. The examples are legion, where states are approving projects that are much higher cost than they need to be, but they're in-state projects. And so states look at integrating wind from a single state perspective, and they'll have a utility in the state, which they just did with National Grid in Massachusetts, pay 20 cents a kilowatt hour for wind from a project offshore, when there is much less expensive wind available in northern New England, for example. I think that is a real problem here. We have to start thinking about electricity as a regional and national business and not a local business if we're going to get where we want to go. On transmission grid expansion, and this is what I've been spending a good bit of my time on the last few years, we've got a system where no one is responsible for planning the national transmission system. FERC is trying to fix that. Not clear it has legislative authority, but it's doing its best. There are no agreements on the planning assumptions, how much renewables you include in the mix, and their location, offshore or onshore, has a lot to do with what transmission facilities you're going to build. So there needs to be agreement on what the electric system is going to look like. There are huge fights over cost responsibility. When Eisenhower built the national highway system, he didn't go out and say people on the East Coast won't pay for Interstate 80 from Denver to Albuquerque because they get no benefit from it. It was treated as a social good, and we all paid for it through our taxes. But we haven't gotten there with respect to electric transmission. So anytime someone proposes a major transmission line, the first big fight is over cost responsibility. And we have some people who want to look at every single line that gets built, perform sophisticated analyses about who benefits in relative amounts, and try and allocate the costs to customers based on those beneficiary pays principles. And that's probably good fundamental economics, but it basically stops the entire process in its tracks. And FERC is trying to convince the industry and Congress that the right way to do this is simply to spread the cost broadly, and that when all is said and done, everyone's getting a benefit from the stronger system that exists. And in fact, the reality is that until the new transmission facilities are built, people don't know how they're going to use it. The way the electric industry works is if a resource is in place that can move power, they'll start looking at buying power at the other end of that line. And so to try and determine in advance who the beneficiaries are is kind of a fool's errand and doesn't even get you to the right answer. And finally, there's the question of siting. Unlike the natural gas industry, we site all electric transmission facilities at the state level, except for a small amount on federal land where the Bureau of Land Management generally stands in the way and says no. And as a result of that, it's virtually, that's an overstatement, it's very difficult to site a large interstate transmission line. And the way to describe it is, think about a transmission line that starts in South Dakota with a collector system for South Dakota wind, runs through Iowa, I don't know my Midwest geography well enough, but runs through the Midwest to Chicago to deliver power to Chicago. Well, folks in Chicago, folks in the intervening states, and folks in North Dakota all look at that line differently. And they each have a different view as to whether they're benefiting from the existence of that line. And so under the current rules, we're going to have a big fat fight over cost responsibility. And then we're going to have a big fight over siting, because if someone is made responsible for the cost of transmission that they don't want to pay in their state, that's an invitation for the local state authorities to disapprove it or make it so expensive that it can't get built. In 2005, Congress passed a law which gave the FERC federal backstop siting authority within what were known as national interest electric transmission corridors. And the process was supposed to work as follows. DOE goes out and does studies and determines where we have differences in costs and need more transmission. Am I up to, how am I, I'm past. I'm going to finish. In any event, that law didn't work, and we have to go back to the drawing board. Okay, thank you.
Generally the right place. Thank you. So I'm going to just show one slide and represent at this point the type of research that's going on to lower the cost. The cost of renewables is too high. It has to come down. We recognize that, and it's the reason in academia that we have those researchers that spend years in specific areas. And there are several right now working directly in the area of renewables, a couple to tie directly to Dave's comment. One comment Dave made was in the intermittent nature of solar and wind. Both of them now in the new EIA results that have been released in terms of the cost of renewable energy are now getting closer. They're in the 8-9 cent range of competing with, or I should say wind is in the 8-9 cent range of competing. Solar higher than that of competing with coal-based electricity. And yet, obviously, they bring an additional issue with intermittency. A couple things that are going on in that area. One to the top right-hand box is storage. Storage in the recent proposals over the course of the last year, we are operating around $1,000 a kilowatt hour right now in the cost of storage, and those numbers are being requested in DOE and ARPA-E proposals at the level of $100. So 10% of the cost, and we recently at CASE have just won a $2.2 million award for a less than $100 cost of a storage system. It happens to be in a capacitor, a hybrid capacitor battery system. In addition, we have just won an award from Sandia National Lab to also develop a system which is less than $100. So one key element, storage is still costing something in order to bring it to market more than the cost of the solar or the wind that it is going to help reduce the intermittency of. And yet the substantial reduction in that cost is a picture that we're seeing coming and that we're participating directly in right now in the area. The second point that Dave made was on the transmission grid expansion. And it will be intriguing as Jean talks as well about what it is to bring a real project to bear. Recently, I believe in the New York project, NYPA has published something like greater than $400 million for the cost of the transmission and distribution system associated with bringing wind into that region. And that's not for this Lake Erie project, but this is the one that New York is talking about. And so some of the novel ideas that are being looked at to change the game, to take away the typical grid transmission and distribution concept and think of what it would mean to bring wind to shore, being that the demand centers, at least for this Great Lake regions, are very close to that shoreline, are not only novel but greatly reduce the need to build expensive and heavy infrastructure. And so those are a couple of the things directly related to attempting to bring that cost of wind and transmission and distribution down. So with that, Carol, back to you.
So cozy up here.
It's going to get to the front of his.
Yep, it's good. So I'm an engineer, but I have just words and not even any slides, so you just have to like listen to me. I'll try and move around a bit. I'm happy to be here. I'm a Cleveland native, although I haven't lived here for a bit, a Case Western Reserve alumni, although that's been a bit ago as well. Long career in Ohio and then BP, about 10 years overseas, and about 2 years ago, I joined the government. So as Diane mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the government's role in energy efficiency and renewable energy, how the government supports technology innovation, development, and deployment, and in particular, I want to cover a little bit about what your investment was in the Recovery Act, also known as the stimulus bill, which added some impressive funding into this area. And I also want to talk a little bit, so first I'll talk about the Recovery Act itself, and then a little bit about what I saw the Recovery Act doing inside the government. There was a bit of transformation there in just enacting that. So the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was really a very large scale and meaningful down payment on the nation's energy and environment future. The energy components of the Recovery Act represent the largest single investment in clean energy in American history. The investments of about $80 billion for clean energy across the federal government, if you add in the cost share amount, add up to about $150 billion. So it really is substantial funding that we're talking about. And this was through a combination of grants, but also loans and tax incentives. And the Department of Energy, where I recently joined, played a central role in that. So this about $150 billion plus with the government plus private capital helps catalyze a transformation in 4 areas, and I'll talk a little bit about each of those. The first is increasing energy efficiency. The second is doubling our renewable energy generation. There's a restructuring of the transport system and also work on the grid infrastructure, which we've mentioned a little bit in the last couple presentations. So on energy efficiency, again, DOE is making the largest single investment ever in buildings energy efficiency in the U.S. The Recovery Act expanded tax credits substantially for doing energy efficiency improvements in homes. And at the same time, there was $5 billion put into something called the Weatherization Assistance Program, which does energy audits in low-income homes and then does the improvements in the homes. So you both get the benefit of improved energy efficiency in homes where people couldn't really afford to do that, and also helping them by lowering their utility bills. And the weatherization program to date under the Recovery Act has already weatherized 300,000 low-income homes, and we're on track to weatherize 500,000 by the end of 2011. And in addition, there have been dozens of U.S. manufacturers of energy efficiency products and energy efficiency appliances, and some opening of new facilities or expanding existing operations that were funded by tax credits under the Recovery Act. So that was energy efficiency. For renewable energy, the investments in renewable generation and advanced energy manufacturing included things like loan guarantees, manufacturing tax credits, and grants in lieu of tax credits, which was a program called 1603, which someone referred to earlier, which is expiring at the end of this year. But that was interesting in the effect that the actual conversion that the government made of tax credits into grants when the economy was having problems and businesses actually didn't have enough tax because they're having revenue issues to take advantage of tax credits. So that program was reversed into a grant and I think did a lot of good in spurring generation. Over 1,800 private companies nationwide have received these tax cuts or cash assistance for clean energy manufacturing or production. On transportation, 70 private companies and researchers in over 30 states have received grants to help build the American advanced battery and electric vehicle manufacturing industry, really from the ground up. There's 30 new advanced battery and electric vehicle component plants opening across the country because of these investments. All of the recipients, and this is notable and I'll talk about it a bit later, but all of the recipients of this money matched the government investment at least dollar for dollar. Before the Recovery Act, the U.S. produced just 2% of the world's advanced batteries, but because of the Recovery Act, we'll have the capacity to produce 20% in 2012 and up to 40% by 2015. Before the Recovery Act, the 100-mile range electric vehicle battery cost was $33,000. Because of the high volume manufacturing that the Recovery Act is spurring, that will be cut in half, with the batteries costing about $16,000 by the end of 2013 and just $10,000 by the end of 2015. And before the Recovery Act, there were less than 500 electric vehicle charging stations in the nation, and because of the Recovery Act, there will be over 20,000 by 2012. On to the grid. The Department of Energy is making the largest investment in grid modernization in history. That's another one of those, in case I'm not making it clear, largest investment in this area in the U.S. history. $4 billion in Recovery Act funds has been invested in smart grid projects across 46 states, so almost all of the states, to help build a more stable, secure nationwide electrical grid, which clearly has issues, as we talked about in the last couple presentations. There's already more than 2.5 million smart meters that have been installed in homes and businesses nationwide to help consumers reduce their energy use, and we're on track for 18 million total meters being installed through the Recovery Act. The deployment also includes hundreds of digital sensors, 200,000 smart transformers, and nearly 700 smart automated substations, which help the power companies replace units before they fail, or at least to respond more effectively to restore service when bad weather knocks down the power lines. And I mentioned before the idea of leveraging private capital. In addition to the government funds injected into this sector, another important element is how the Recovery Act helped leverage private capital. The Recovery Act has proven successful in drawing private capital off the sidelines to help fund the economic recovery and accelerate green job growth. Of the $14 billion in competitive grants under the Recovery Act, about 90% required some kind of cost share from a project sponsor. And these kind of show, as we were talking about, the appropriate role for the government. It's not just investing in innovation, but when they play an appropriate role, it brings private capital in off of the sidelines. I mentioned I would also cover a little bit about what we saw in the government the Recovery Act was doing actually for the government and its transformation potential on the government as an organization. Many agencies were able to put funds in the hands of businesses and citizens faster than they typically were able to do. There was really this big push and momentum to move quickly. We've seen to date pretty low levels of fraud, waste, and abuse through the transparency that was put into the system. And again, we worked to leverage the dollars with private sector contributions. Some of the lessons that we learned, and I'll go quickly through an example on each of them, is we saw how collaboration helps break through bureaucracy, how competition improves the results, and something about transparency and accountability and the vigilance of management. For collaboration, the administration really couldn't have done this without making some real changes in how the government agencies worked with each other. One example is a project that I worked on in DC before I took on my more recent job in Denver. There was a manufacturing tax credit that Congress said should be done by DOE and the IRS together. And being new to the government, I didn't realize in taking that on that that was nearly impossible to get the agencies to work together. So just kind of plowed through like it might be possible. And turns out that if you get enough like-minded people who are just going to figure out a way to get things done, you can move things through. It was not simple, but What we managed to demonstrate was another type of funding vehicle, which is a competitive capped tax credit, which is not usual. 1603, for example, was a tax credit that as long as you get in by the deadline, you get the tax credit. This was a competitive tax credit. And I thought the uniqueness of it was showing that you use different agencies for their strengths. So the Department of Energy did the accepting the grants and the competitive analysis of them, which is what DOE does. And then the administration of the money through a tax credit, who does taxes? So the IRS did that administration, and we worked jointly on what were our strengths. On competition, I think it's worth noting out that the Recovery Act was not about earmarks. The grants generally were about competition and finding the best project, and most programs were oversubscribed, so the merit review was very important. In the Department of Energy, Secretary Chu sent a note to colleges, universities, and professional societies asking for experts to help with these reviews. And all told, nearly 3,000 independent experts contributed and completed about 25,000 reviews of DOE applications. And I just wanted to add into that a bit about transparency. The other couple things that we saw during the Recovery Act was there was both an incentive by the administration to be transparent and also some requirements with the Recovery Act to put things online. But there were literally weekly reports on how each project was doing, which you could still see on recovery.gov. And that kind of transparency, I think, was unique in the government and allowed people to be held responsible for their particular goals. You can't, if you can't measure things, you can't really see how people are doing. And while that might not seem particularly revolutionary, it was in some aspects or some parts of the government. So in summary, I just wanted to recap that the Recovery Act was this huge investment, about $150 billion if you count the private sector funding. And the Recovery Act, its scale and the urgency also create an environment for reform within DOE and the government overall. And these Recovery Act reforms are now kind of working to be embedded in the government so as to be enduring. And I think it's worth noting that President Obama put into the 2011 State of the Union address, kind of reflecting this, that we cannot win the future with a government of the past. Thanks.
So I'm Gene Amadori, also a Case alumni, and my family, my daughter, son, my wife, all went here as well. But sure.
Oh, this is it. Okay.
That's it. This is it. He was going to change my presentation to the one that I wasn't going to do. Anyways, I also want to especially thank all of you coming down here from Canada. I just want you to know that I live in the eastern part of Ohio, and just to report to you, if you've not been following the Stanley Cup, the team that I support, the Pittsburgh Penguins, did win, and I'm anticipating another win tonight. And if any of you know whether Sidney Crosby will be back, we're hoping for him in the second round. So anyways, that kicked off. One of the things I wanted to say is, you know, I'm going to present this from the business side. We are working on a project in Lake Erie right now that, you know, our Canadian friends were really hot on moving this forward in the northern part of Lake Erie. And I know with all the changes in the government's thinking that's been put on hold. But we've had a number of contacts from people in Canada just kind of following very closely what we're running into and how we're progressing through all of the issues associated with putting offshore wind in Lake Erie. So I go through this fairly rapidly, but just so you understand, again, unlike what's going on in Europe, the offshore wind industry right now is really to support economic development. These projects initially are not about energy, they're about job creation. And I think the thing that we want to get across to all of you, and especially with the people on the panel with me, that these initial projects, the first one that we're going to be building is about 25 to 30 megawatts, which is 5 to 6 turbines out in the water. They're all the wrong size. They're way too small. They're not scalable, and so the soft costs, and there are a number of attorneys in the audience I know, when you look at what we have to do from a regulatory standpoint, from all of the other studies we have to do, environmental and whatnot, whether we built 1,000 megawatts or we built 30, the price would, or the cost to do it, we've got the same. So to get this thing moving, what we've done is we've worked with a whole group of stakeholders, and some of these are on the screen right now, but you can see my alma mater is in the middle on the center there, especially one of the research institutions. But we've got a whole lot of stakeholders in the state of Ohio, as well as a couple of very, very large companies, General Electric and Bechtel, one of the largest construction companies in North America involved. And we're going to move this project forward. Now, one of the things that's critical to this, though, is the economic development. So the state of Ohio is very interested in what's going on from a standpoint of economic development and job creation. And I want to give you all a little bit of a history of what's going on this project. So back in 2004, the Cleveland Foundation, which is a philanthropic group in Cleveland, provided a relatively large grant to get the study started, and tried to identify whether there were any showstoppers to put offshore wind in Lake Erie off the shore of Cleveland. And the result of that study basically said that we had a lot of things going for us. We have a very shallow lake. We're going to be putting these turbines in about 70 feet of water, 25 meters. We don't have hurricanes. We don't have lots of major storms. We do have ice that they do not have on the Atlantic or up in the North Atlantic. But the other real key to this, and was mentioned earlier, we're not very far from population. So our transmission lines are very, very short relative to bringing in wind from South Dakota into Chicago, as an example. So we feel very good about some of those things. We've been progressing through all of what you see on the screen to the point where our firm, it's a partnership of a couple of companies, into the point of this 2010, 2011, where we now have a lease option on square miles out in the lake to go ahead and put these turbines in. And we're now in the process of doing all the geotech and geophysical and the birds and the bats and the aquatic studies that will make the various environmental agencies comfortable with what we're doing. Again, as I talked about, this is all about jobs. These are ports that are not in the U.S. right now, but you'll see kind of that lower left-hand photograph was over in Europe, and you see the size and the requirements of these ports for these kinds of facilities. Remember, the turbines that we're going to be putting in, unlike some of the ones that you've seen onshore, the diameter of the blades, are approaching 350 feet, 100 meters. The blades themselves just cannot be moved around on conventional roads. They're going to all be brought in, either manufactured close to the shore or brought in by ship. Same thing with the turbines. They're very, very large. The initial group of turbines we're going to put in are 4 to 5 megawatts each, and this is how we're going to start driving the cost down. As we continue to build larger and larger, the scale will help us start driving the cost down. The initial project, though, the study that was commissioned by LECO, the Lake Erie Energy Development Company, a nonprofit, said that this initial phase was going to produce between 400 to 600 jobs in Ohio. That's the whole supply chain, that's the construction of the foundations, that's the maritime, all of those things associated with that. It does not include the turbines. The turbines will not be manufactured in the U.S. Right now, General Electric's plant for offshore turbines is in Norway, and so they will be coming in this initial phase. As we build up, and if we're successful with this and we can scale and get the price down, the hope is ultimately to build a manufacturing facility in Ohio, but that remains to be seen. Again, just so you have a feel for how many jobs are actually being created in Europe, and I know some of these numbers are pretty hard to see, but basically the thing that I would say to you right now, this is a $100 billion industry in between Great Britain and the continent.
They do have a very, very aggressive feed-in tariff, and that's what's driving this, unlike what we have here in the U.S. You know, what we're using to get the power purchase agreement, it basically is legislation to take advantage of the renewable energy credits. But this is a real industry in Europe. Right now, there's over 40,000 people employed in this industry, and if you look at some of the numbers down on that last line, 2020, or 2030, I'm sorry, it's expected to be almost 215,000 people employed in this industry. So it's real. And the thing that's scary to all of us here in the U.S. and probably to you in Canada as well is that the next big surge on this is going to be the Chinese. Chinese are already designing turbines that are well over 8 megawatts with the goal of 10 megawatts per turbine, and they're going to be deploying them substantially in Asia. And that is one of the things that is certainly a concern. I know you're talking about the Canadian content, and the U.S. is certainly concerned about that as well. And we are potentially going to have turbines manufactured in China brought into here. And again, from an offshore standpoint, you know, bringing a turbine from China or bringing a turbine from Europe, you know, there's not a whole lot of difference there. So what we've got to really do is advance the ball in the U.S. and Canada as rapidly as possible. One of the things that we like to point to, because you know we're in a port here in Cleveland, and there's one in Lorraine, which is a little west of here, and one in Ashtabula, which is a little east of here, all have substantial port facilities. They're all pretty much dead. There's nothing coming in and out of them. At Cleveland, I think it's 8 freighters a month, which is not a lot, a little more than 1 a week. But what we're trying to do is take advantage of the existing port infrastructure. Same thing over in Ashtabula and Lorraine. So these pictures here are actually at Bremerhaven over in Germany, and this was a massive port from World War II that really just laid fallow for many, many years. And now because of the offshore industry in Europe, it's now a very, very thriving port. And this is what we're hoping to see here off of the shore of Cleveland. Again, this is all about job creation initially. As we put this first project in, this demonstration project in, and demonstrate that, you know, we're not harming the environment, that the industry does produce the jobs that we're talking about, and that there's a path forward to getting costs down. You know, we anticipate this kind of activity being, you know, on the shore of Cleveland. The photograph on the left there is a sample of most likely the kind of foundations we'll be using. Those are called gravity foundations, and each one of those weighs about 300 tons of concrete and steel, and those would be floated out into the lake and then sunk in the appropriate location. You can get a feel for the size of those, because that, I mean, it's kind of hard to tell, but on top of that main one in the center, there's right at the very top, there's a workman standing, so it gives you a feel that that's almost 70 feet tall right there. Again, as we talked about earlier, I think you know, and again, I've been in this industry, the electricity industry, a long time, but I think one of the things that I struggle with all the time is, you know, offshore wind is very, very expensive, onshore wind is expensive, solar is expensive, relative to what's going on in a base coal, base nuclear, and all of that. But very few times when you talk to utility, utility industry, you get an answer and say, you know, okay, but if I build a nuclear plant today, and, you know, knowing how the industry works, if I started today, it won't be up and running for 10 years. So in 2021, what would the power coming out of that be? And I would tell you right now, no one would bet on it, first of all, but it's certainly going to be more than 5 cents a kilowatt hour. And I think that's the kind of numbers that we always hear from our utility friends saying, hey, why would I buy offshore wind right now at 25 cents a kilowatt hour when I can produce it from coal for 5 or nuclear for 4? And that's true. I mean, why would you? Okay. But that nuclear plant that they're going to build, and I think you said there might be 2 that are progressing, and the only way they're going to be built is with federal loan guarantees. But what's the power going to cost from those? What's the power going to cost from clean coal? What's the power going to cost from even our nuclear plants today, if we have to go in and refit them with some of the safeties that we're going to have to do based on what happened in Japan? So we anticipate, and some of this comes from the DOE thinking as well, that offshore wind is going to be, you know, the target is to get it down to 12 cents in 2020. And, you know, for us to get there, we've got to have that first project and then a larger one and a larger one and a larger one. We have an opportunity for Ohio right now. We're poised very, very well. We've got an awful lot of supply chain manufacturing already in Ohio, where we've got a population base close to the lake. We're part of what's referred to as PJM, which is the largest independent system operator of the grid in the United States. So we're getting power from the lake into that grid allows us to really actually send it anywhere in the eastern part of the United States. And we really want to make this the epicenter. And again, I think what we're going to do here is going to enable our Canadian neighbors to take advantage of what we learn in Lake Erie relative to all of the things that we're going to do impacting the environment as well. Specifically, the turbines will be located about 7 miles offshore from Cleveland. You can kind of see that up in that far corner. We're going to be putting 5 to 8 turbines out there, total of about 25 to 30 megawatts. Very, very small system. Going to produce enough power, enough energy to do 5,000 to 6,000 homes. A lot of things have been done already down that left-hand side. Those are the kind of items that take anywhere from 1 to 3 years. So the good news is a lot of that's been done. It allows us to, you know, potentially, unless we see some additional showstoppers, get this thing built and up and running in late 2012 and then in 2013. So our hope and our plan is to have this in commercial operation by late 2013, early 2014. And we have a lot of pieces in place to get that done. Kind of the things we've got to get done in the short term. Like I said, we're working on a legislative activity right now in the state of Ohio and in Columbus, in the capital, working on coming up with a methodology to take advantage of the existing renewable energy credit rate structure to convert that to offshore and help us put ourselves in a position where the energy will be sold into the grid through the utility companies by taking advantage of the REC structure. We've got to work very closely with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, ODNR, on taking our lease option that we have right now and converting it to a lease. These are all submerged land leases for land under the lake. And then the Ohio Power Siting Board as well. And then ACOE stands for the Army Corps of Engineers. So we've got a lot of work to do, and I think what's difficult with these projects is we're the first. So there's no cookbook, there's no template. Every time we sit down with whatever agency it is, it's starting from scratch, educating, and then working out, you know, this is not a dock, this is, you know, and that's what they really kind of want to force us into, well, that kind of impact and whatnot. And so many, many things here are so different that it just takes a long time. So, thank you very much.
So I see that we have a few minutes for questions and answers, please. Are there any for panel members?
My name is Jim Peterson. Gene?
Yes.
I'm from Toronto. What is the Stanley Cup?
Please hurry.
I'm Roy Norton. I live in Detroit, and I don't know that I can answer your question.
Sure you can.
In Detroit, they think they know what the Stanley Cup is. They expect they'll win it every year. I'm the Consul General of Canada to Ohio. I appreciated Mr. Amadori's comments about the integrated economy. You didn't provide the stats, I will. Last year, $31 billion in two-way trade between Ohio and Canada, with Ohio continuing to enjoy, as it has routinely for years, surplus in that trade. A thoroughly integrated economy, supply chains that are totally integrated. I'm hoping the Department of Energy is listening, because in the Recovery Act, the spending that you described at great length is conditioned to Buy American provisions, which we didn't like and which we proceeded to negotiate, spent a year negotiating with the U.S. administration, and a reciprocal arrangement was struck whereby Canada and the United States would each have access to subnational procurement on above a certain threshold. And what we're experiencing now, not far from here in Mahoning County, Ohio, in fact, is a phenomenon whereby a DOE-funded project is being broken, it would seem, into smaller bits and pieces, perhaps, I can only say perhaps, so as to evade or avoid the threshold requirements, meaning that a Canadian firm that is partnering with an Ohio firm in northern Ohio is being discriminated against in terms of being able to win on the lowest bid basis that project. It would be like, to play it under introduction, Canada saying that Sidney Crosby, if he were well enough to play, could only play providing Pittsburgh were not playing a Canadian team.
That's the rule we Washingtonians want.
Which we would, of course, never do. So take note, take it back if you would, and make some inquiries, and we hope that we can get this resolved favorably.
Thank you.
We're Pickering from the Peterson Institute. I had a question for the panel, and I guess anybody else in the audience who wants to take a crack at this about renewables and reliability. And obviously there are many countries, or at least a few countries, in Europe that have far higher percentages of generation from renewable energy than the US does, and far higher percentages from wind and solar than Canada. So I guess my question is, with the intermittency issue inherent to renewable energy, what is the threshold in terms of percentage of generation past which, is it not on? Okay. Past which you start to have serious reliability issues?
First of all, I think it is as much a cost issue as a reliability issue. You can firm up the intermittent power, but you have to build other power plants, particularly fast natural gas plants with automatic generation control, which can fill in when the plants go down. So it's a cost issue as much as anything else. That being said, we've had one incident so far in Texas where the wind just stopped blowing. And I think something like 1,500 megawatts of energy just disappeared literally in minutes. And the system voltage went down, and they were near a cascading outage. They managed to pick the system up. My guess is that they're learning from that, so next time it happens, they'll know how to deal with it. But NERC is North American Electric Reliability Council, which is responsible for reliability and establishes the rules, is very worried about this, and they're studying that very question and trying to figure out how to do it. I think at the end of the day, it's about money and not about reliability, and most reliability issues end up being about money. But it adds to the cost. It has to be considered when you compare cost of wind versus something like a gas plant or a coal plant, which is not variable.
Dick Cunningham and Steptoe Johnson. I'd like to pursue this thing of feed-in tariffs for just a moment, because I've looked at this as a trade issue. The Chinese use it extensively and have used it quite successfully to subsidize the demand side for wind power, and have built up what is probably the largest wind power industry in the world. The Spaniards done the same thing, although apparently they overdid it, and there's a bit of a collapse coming there. But why is it? And from a WTO standpoint, it's much cleaner. Subsidies to producers are much more difficult to sustain under the WTO rules than subsidies to consumption. So why aren't we doing this?
Two reasons. Number one, we have philosophy in this country to run things efficiently, and subsidies are not generally viewed positively unless a politician can hide them. More importantly, we set electric rates to consumers at the state level and not the federal level. So the responsibility to establish these kinds of feed-in tariffs for retail electric service would go to the states. And in that circumstance, I think it's very hard to establish a national policy.
But let me add to that as well, even though I have somebody on the panel from the DOE, and I know she doesn't write policy, but one of the biggest problems we have in the US is there is no national energy policy. So what happens is each state, and you know, we live in Ohio, or I live in Ohio, Diane lives in Ohio. Ohio has a renewable portfolio standard. Pennsylvania has one. New York has one. Everybody has something different. And in reality, what's happening is we are driving it by each state having their own renewable policy, and was driving it upstream to the federal government. And to really get to your point, what we want to do is we want to go the other direction as well. We want the federal government to set a policy on some of this. Because, and I agreed with this gentleman about, you know, oil and electricity don't quite mix, but at some point in time, we've got to start putting values of, you know, our military supporting what's going on in the Mideast. How much does that cost us? How much does that add to the cost of gasoline? How much does that cost to everything that we're doing? It becomes more of a political issue than it is just purely energy. But at some point in time in the US, we're going to wake up and we've got to develop a federal policy. Because right now, it's just being driven by each state. And one of our worries in Ohio is that state policy could change 3 years from now. We're building, you know, this little farm that I showed you, it's $150 million. We're going to bankers and say, oh, by the way, we need a 20-year deal. And they're saying, well, how long are you going to get this money going forward? And we say, well, we think. And they say, well, we don't invest on we think. And so those kind of issues across the board, we've got to settle here. And, you know, same thing what's going on in Canada. I mean, there's going to be 4,000 megawatts in Lake Erie. Now there's going to be none on your side of the border.
For those of you who, like, unlike me, know the economics of the industry, putting aside the fact that it's state level versus federal level, that's right. If we had an energy policy, would we be better off using more feed-in tariffs? Or should we stick with subsidizing producers? Because right now you got a problem, because
Exactly.
it's not economically competitive. You can either force the price of carbon up, you can use feed-in tariffs, or to create the demand artificially, or you can subsidize the production. And I'm not sure I have a view as to which is, just from an economic standpoint, better. I know damn well from a WTO perspective which is better, which would be the feed-in tariffs.
I probably differ from the others on the panel, Dick, but I think establishing a price on carbon, if we can agree that there should be a price on carbon, what it should be would be a good thing, because that would be real economics. That's an externality that's not being priced into the cost of coal power, if you believe that global warming is a serious problem. But we can't agree on that. But providing subsidies, I just think is a fool's errand. I would rather put our money, I'd rather allow the electric system to be run as efficiently as possible and put our money into research and development so that we bring closer the day when we don't have to subsidize these other options. I think that's the better way to do it, and we're more likely to win that way than trying to pick winners and losers. The feed-in tariffs have been abandoned, my understanding, in much of Europe because they've been a failure. They're bringing forth uneconomic sources of electricity, and they're real unhappy with them.
And perhaps just to complete this one, because I do know we're running against time, I understand we're leading into a panel that's going to talk about cost of taxes, and I think it'll be a very good hour and a half to come. So thank you for both views. And please stay around, because what's coming next is just on that topic. One last question, if I could, please.
So my question builds a bit on the discussion we've just had, but not in terms of whether it should be cap and trade or a carbon tax. It's more, it seems when you listen to the presentations today, it's inevitable that we're going to have cleaner, greener energy, and it's going to cost more. Everyone seems to accept that. The question is, when is that going to happen, 2015 or 2020 or 2025? When we listen to initiatives like the one that Mr. Amaduri has put forward, the question I have is, why are we sticking our heads in the sand? Europe has been quite successful with wind energy. We have a tremendous issue in Canada, the NIMBY issue, not in my backyard. But in Europe, it's typically not in people's backyards either. It's off in the North Sea or somewhere else, where, as in Lake Erie, it's 7 miles out, and we have lots of wind on the East Coast and lots of wind on the West Coast in both of our countries. So why aren't we getting on with that and just recognizing the reality? Because there is this huge time period. So for some time, you're a not-for-profit operation. So at some point, the government can turn that. If governments can support the GMs of the world, governments can support these kinds of initiatives. And when they become financially profitable, where the cost of other energy has gone up significantly, you sell the thing and you make a lot of money and you recoup your costs, right? Or hopefully you make a huge profit if you're business-minded. So continue to struggle with why we're not more forward-looking here. Because it's inevitable. It's going to happen.
We have an almost inexhaustible supply of domestic natural gas that can be produced at about $4 or $5 a minute. It is a great option, and unless we have agreement that we should not pursue it and we should put our money into renewables, we're not going to get anywhere. That's having an energy policy, and people just disagree.
Yeah, I think while we have a range of views on things, what we all come together on, what is needed is a national energy policy, and in the absence of that, you really struggle to push an overall agenda.
I think it's a great wrap-up on national energy policy. I think an equally good wrap-up is in terms of your timing question. We all probably as well share a common belief that there is no either or, that we need all types of energy, and it includes some of these renewables and many of them to be viewed as well as natural gas, fossil fuels. I thank you for attending. I thank the panel for helping. Thank you very much.